Good evening, my dear friends. I'm Jake Walker, and this is the newest story on my channel. If a man buys a dog, does that make him her owner? On a rain-soaked mountain road in Montana, a wealthy businessman threw Daisy into the cold like broken luggage. But retired Navy SEAL Jack Walker stopped, carried the wounded German Shepherd home, and unknowingly stepped into the shattered bond between a forgotten war veteran and the only soul still waiting for him. Late autumn had settled over Ash Hollow, Montana, with a cold mountain rain that turned the pine roads black and silver beneath the fading evening sky. The little town sat between steep forest ridges and the wide, restless shadow of Cedar Creek Lake, a place where smoke curled from chimneys, porch lights glowed early, and people spoke softly when the weather grew mean. Jack Walker, 58 years old, drove alone along the old service road after repairing a damaged wooden bridge for the county. He was a retired United States Navy SEAL, broad-shouldered, weathered, and quiet in the way of men who had learned that words could not always carry what the heart survived. His gray hair was clipped short, his jaw still sharp beneath a few days of silver stubble, and his pale blue eyes had the steady, distant look of someone always listening for danger no one else could hear. Most people in Ash Hollow respected him, but few truly knew him. Jack lived in a log cabin near the pine forest, kept his tools clean, paid his bills on time, helped neighbors without staying for supper, and disappeared whenever crowds gathered. Years earlier, on a mission he never spoke of, his closest friend and teammate, Michael "Mick" Harper, had not come home. Since then, Jack had carried grief like an old pack strapped too tightly across his chest. He told himself solitude was peace, though some nights it felt more like a locked room. That evening, as rain tapped hard against his windshield, Jack passed the banners being tied near Main Street for Ash Hollow's upcoming Veterans Remembrance Festival. The new mayor, Tyler Brooks, a polished young man with bright teeth, expensive boots, and ambition shining off him like fresh varnish, wanted the festival to attract tourists and investors. Jack disliked the idea of grief being dressed up with sponsor logos, but he had kept his opinion to himself. He was nearly past Raven Bend when a black luxury SUV appeared ahead, parked crookedly beside the road, its hazard lights blinking red into the rain. Jack slowed. A tall man in a dark wool coat stood near the rear passenger door. Even through the rain, Jack recognized Richard Coleman, the wealthy developer who owned the new mountain resort above Ash Hollow. Richard was handsome in a cold, practiced way, with neatly combed dark hair, a square jaw, and the smooth confidence of a man used to having doors open before he touched them. Beside him stood a slim woman in a cream-colored coat, Sarah Whitmore, a sharp-faced brunette with pale skin, careful makeup, and the nervous elegance of someone paid to make ugly things look respectable. Jack saw movement inside the SUV. A dog. A German Shepherd, female, full-grown but too thin beneath her wet black and tan coat. One ear stood high, the other bent slightly at the tip, giving her a brave, broken look. Richard opened the door, gripped her collar, and pulled her out into the rain. The dog stumbled, her right hind leg folding for a second beneath her. She did not bark. She only braced herself, amber eyes wide, as if she had already learned that making noise did not always bring mercy. "She ruined everything," Sarah said, her voice thin with irritation. "The photos, the lobby rug, the entire campaign." Richard looked down at the dog as if she were a failed purchase. "I bought a loyal-looking dog, not a liability." Jack's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He had seen cruelty before, in war and in peace, and the worst kind was rarely loud. It wore clean gloves. Richard unclipped something from the dog's collar, then shoved her toward the roadside ditch. She tried to stand firm, but her injured leg betrayed her. With one hard motion, he pushed her into the wet grass and snowmelt at the edge of the road. Sarah looked around quickly, her phone half raised, then lowered it. "No one will care about one dog in this weather," she muttered. The SUV doors slammed, the engine growled, the red lights vanished around the bend, leaving only rain, pine shadows, and the small dark shape trembling beside the ditch. Jack sat still for one breath, then another. The old soldier inside him took inventory. Plate number, vehicle make, direction of travel, 2 adults, no immediate threat. But the man beneath the soldier had already opened the truck door. Cold rain struck his face as he stepped out. He moved slowly down the slope, boots sinking into mud and wet leaves. The German Shepherd lifted her head. Her muzzle was gray at the edges, not from age alone, but from exhaustion. She was perhaps 5 or 6 years old, with a deep chest, intelligent eyes, and a body that still remembered discipline even while weakness shook through it. A faded tag remained on the collar. Daisy. Jack crouched several feet away, making himself smaller. "Easy, Daisy," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "I'm not him." Daisy's ears twitched. A faint growl stirred in her throat, thin as a match flame in wind. Jack almost smiled. "Good girl. Still got thunder in you." He removed his jacket and laid it open near her. When he reached closer, Daisy flinched but did not snap. Jack saw a raw mark beneath the collar, mud in her fur, and the careful way she guarded her back leg. Anger rose in him, hot and clean, but he pushed it down. Anger could march later. Mercy had work to do now. He wrapped Daisy in the jacket and lifted her with the care of a man carrying something sacred from a battlefield. She was lighter than she should have been. Her head came to rest near his shoulder, and for one strange second, Jack felt her breath against his neck like a small prayer that did not yet trust heaven. His cabin waited beyond the lake road, dark except for the porch light he always left on, though no one ever came. Inside, the air smelled of cedar, old coffee, gun oil locked away in a cabinet, and wood smoke from the stove. Jack carried Daisy to the hearth, laid her on a wool blanket, and warmed water in a dented kettle. He cleaned the mud from her paws, checked her leg, loosened the collar, and spoke only when necessary. Daisy watched every movement. She did not beg. She did not wag. She judged him with the grave suspicion of a wounded queen inspecting a kingdom made of one lonely room. Jack called Dr. Martha Green, the town veterinarian, a practical woman in her early 60s with silver hair, brown hands, and a voice that could calm both horses and foolish men. Martha told him to keep Daisy warm, offer small sips of water, and bring her in when the road cleared. After the call, Jack sat in the chair across from the fire. Rain scratched the windows. The old wall clock ticked with stubborn patience. On the table lay a flyer for the Veterans Remembrance Festival. Mayor Brooks's smiling face printed beneath words like honor, unity, and opportunity. Jack turned it face down. He thought of Mick Harper, who had laughed like a church bell and once claimed that bad coffee was proof God wanted soldiers to stay humble. Jack had not laughed at that memory in years. Near midnight, Daisy drank 3 careful laps of water. Near morning, while the fire softened into red coals, she shifted painfully across the blanket and laid her muzzle against Jack's old military boots. Not trust. Not yet. Perhaps only exhaustion. Perhaps only the instinct to rest near the least dangerous thing in the room. But Jack felt something inside him loosen, a frozen latch touched by spring. He lowered his hand to the floor beside her, not touching, only offering presence. "All right," he whispered. Outside, Ash Hollow slept beneath the cold rain, its festival banners whipping in the dark, its proud men polishing their public kindness, its forgotten souls waiting somewhere beyond warm windows. Inside the cabin, a retired Navy SEAL and a wounded German shepherd kept watch over the same quiet fire. And for the first time in many years, Jack Walker's silence did not feel empty. It felt as if someone had finally answered it. 3 days of cold rain passed over Ash Hollow before the clouds finally began to break apart above the mountains. Thin sunlight spilled through the pine branches like pale gold dust, touching the roofs of cabins and the wet streets of town with the careful gentleness of something returning after a long absence. Jack Walker stood outside his cabin splitting firewood while Daisy rested near the porch steps wrapped in an old army blanket. The German shepherd looked stronger than she had on the night he found her, though she still favored her right hind leg whenever she stood too quickly. Her coat, once caked with mud and rainwater, had regained some of its deep black shine along her back, and the tan fur around her chest glowed warmly beneath the morning light. Yet there remained something solemn in her amber eyes, something older than pain. She watched everything: the trees, the road, Jack. Even the wind moving through the pines seemed to matter to her. Jack had known military dogs overseas that behaved this way. Animals trained not merely to obey, but to assess. Daisy did not act like a pet. She acted like someone still on duty. Jack lowered the axe and glanced toward her. "You planning to supervise all day?" Daisy blinked slowly, but did not move. Jack snorted softly. "Thought so." It had been years since another living creature shared his routines. Strange how quickly silence could grow uncomfortable once it stopped being complete. Inside the cabin, the old coffee pot rattled faintly on the stove. The smell reminded Jack of mornings overseas when soldiers woke before dawn, pretending exhaustion was normal. For a moment he saw Mick Harper again, leaning against a Humvee with sand on his boots and a grin wide enough to mock the entire desert. The memory struck fast and disappeared just as quickly, leaving behind the familiar ache beneath Jack's ribs. Daisy rose slowly and limped toward him. Then something unexpected happened. Jack reached down absent-mindedly to pick up the wood carrier, and Daisy immediately froze at his side, perfectly still, eyes forward, body alert. It was not random behavior. It was response. Jack stared at her. "Hold," he said quietly, testing the word without thinking. Daisy did not move a muscle. The cold air seemed to tighten around them. Jack's expression changed. He knew disciplined obedience when he saw it. This was not backyard training. Someone had worked with her for years. Someone patient. Someone skilled. Daisy looked up at him only after he relaxed his shoulders. "Well now," Jack murmured. "Who taught you that?" Later that afternoon, he drove Daisy into town for her appointment with Dr. Martha Green. Ash Hollow's veterinary clinic sat beside an old bait shop near Main Street, its white wooden sign faded by decades of mountain winters. Martha Green greeted them wearing a dark green sweater and square glasses sliding low on her nose. She was 63, broad-hipped, practical, with weathered brown hands and sharp gray eyes that missed very little. Martha had spent most of her life treating ranch animals, hunting dogs, and stubborn men who ignored injuries too long. She liked Jack because he complained less than most people. Daisy stepped carefully into the exam room, alert but controlled. Martha examined the bruising around her neck, the healing scrape along her leg, and the worn pads beneath her paws. "This dog's been worked hard," Martha said quietly. "Not abused all her life. That's the strange part. Someone cared for her once." Jack leaned against the wall. "I noticed command responses." Martha nodded. "Search and rescue, maybe. Civilian rescue teams often use shepherds this size. See how she scans corners before settling? She's trained to watch unstable areas. Daisy's bent left ear twitched at Martha's voice. Poor girl, Martha murmured. Something frightened her badly. Jack folded his arms. Can fear stay inside an animal that long? Martha looked at him carefully over her glasses. Longer than people admit. The answer sat heavily between them, because both knew she was not only speaking about dogs. After the appointment, Jack stopped at the town square to pick up batteries and canned food before heading home. The square buzzed with preparations for the Veterans Remembrance Festival. Workers hung lanterns between street poles, while volunteers arranged folding tables near the courthouse lawn. Mayor Tyler Brooks moved through the crowd wearing a tailored navy coat and an eager smile polished for photographs. At 38, Tyler looked more like a television host than a politician. His blonde hair stayed perfectly styled even in mountain wind, and he shook hands too often, as though afraid silence might reveal something unfinished beneath his charm. Jack avoided him when possible. Tyler spotted him anyway. "Jack Walker," the mayor called brightly. "Heard you rescued a dog." Jack adjusted the paper bag under his arm. "Heard wrong. Dog rescued herself. I just drove." Tyler laughed too hard. "You should bring her to the festival. Folks love military dogs." Daisy stiffened beside Jack's leg. Jack's eyes cooled. "She's not entertainment." Tyler's smile faltered for half a second before returning. "Of course. Just trying to build community spirit." Jack nodded once and started walking away. He had learned years ago that ambitious men often mistook public attention for human warmth. Daisy suddenly stopped. Her ears lifted sharply. Then, before Jack understood why, she pulled hard on the leash and limped toward the far edge of the square near the old public park beside Cedar Creek. Jack followed quickly. Near a weathered bench sat an elderly man wrapped in a faded army jacket patched at both elbows. Beside him stood an old REV, painted dull blue beneath layers of rust and mountain dust. The vehicle looked one hard winter away from collapse. The man himself appeared carved from the same stubborn material. Walter Hayes was 72 years old, lean and weathered, with a silver beard trimmed unevenly by shaky hands and deep-set brown eyes that carried both exhaustion and humor. His skin was lined heavily from decades of sun, wind, and disappointment. Yet there remained a quiet steadiness about him. His left knee stiffened when he moved, a lingering injury from the Gulf War years earlier. Children in Ash Hollow knew him as the strange old veteran who repaired broken bicycles and toy trucks for free near the lake during summer afternoons. Adults often called him eccentric because kindness embarrassed people who had forgotten how to offer it themselves. Daisy let out a sound Jack had not heard before. Not a bark, not a whine, but something raw and aching from deep inside her chest. Walter looked up slowly. The paper coffee cup slipped from his hand into the dirt. For one frozen second, neither moved. Then Daisy surged forward. Jack loosened the leash instinctively. Daisy crossed the wet grass and pressed herself against Walter's chest with trembling urgency. The old man dropped to his knees despite the pain in his leg. His rough hands buried themselves gently in her fur. "Daisy girl," he whispered, voice breaking apart. "Oh God, little Daisy." Jack stood motionless nearby. He had seen reunions before. Soldiers returning home, fathers meeting children after deployment, widows recognizing voices over military phones. This felt painfully similar. Walter pressed his forehead against Daisy's neck. Tears gathered openly in his beard without shame. Daisy's tail moved weakly for the first time since Jack had found her. "I thought she was gone," Walter whispered. Thought maybe the world finally took the last good thing I had left. Jack approached slowly. She knows you. Walter looked up. Course she knows me. She slept beside my RV nearly 4 years. Daisy stayed pressed against him as though afraid the earth itself might steal him away again. Jack noticed how naturally Walter checked her injured leg, how his fingers examined her ears and paws with practiced care. You trained rescue dogs, Jack said quietly. Walter gave a tired nod. After the war. Avalanche teams mostly. Search crews up north too. He smiled faintly through grief. Daisy learned faster than any dog I ever handled. Daisy looked between the two men, her amber eyes reflecting something strange and uncertain. Jack felt it too. This dog belonged to a story larger than the ditch where he found her. A cold wind swept through the square, carrying the smell of lake water and pine sap. Walter's smile faded. Richard Coleman took her, he said softly. Jack's expression hardened instantly. Walter lowered his gaze. County threatened to tow my RV, said I couldn't properly shelter an animal through winter. Richard offered money. Promised warmth, food, vet care. I knew better. But Daisy was getting older and His voice cracked. I got scared she'd freeze because of me. Daisy nudged Walter's hand gently, as if refusing to let him drown in shame. Walter swallowed hard. Truth is, son, they made me choose between losing my home or losing her. The festival banners fluttered overhead in the cold afternoon wind, while somewhere nearby, children laughed beside the courthouse steps. Yet standing there near Cedar Creek, Jack suddenly understood that loneliness did not always arrive as empty silence. Sometimes it arrived disguised as paperwork, regulations, and polite men with expensive coats. Daisy leaned against Walter again, and Jack saw something pass through the old veteran's tired face. Not happiness exactly, but the fragile return of light to a place that had nearly gone dark forever. Winter arrived early over Montana, like an old god losing patience. By the second week of November, the mountains around Ash Hollow disappeared behind walls of gray cloud, and the air carried that strange metallic stillness that came before heavy snow. Cedar Creek Lake darkened beneath the wind. Pine branches bent low against the cold, and people in town began buying extra propane, canned soup, and batteries long before the first flakes even touched the ground. Jack Walker noticed the signs before anyone else did. Men who had survived war learned to recognize pressure before impact. That afternoon, he stood outside his cabin repairing the latch on the woodshed while Daisy paced the porch restlessly. The German Shepherd had grown stronger during the past few days, but something about the changing sky unsettled her deeply. Her ears stayed alert, her body tense beneath her thickening coat. Every few minutes she stopped to stare toward the distant ridge above town, as if listening to footsteps no human ear could hear. Walter Hayes sat nearby on an overturned crate wrapped in his faded army jacket, carefully repairing a child's fishing reel with a small screwdriver pulled from his coat pocket. He worked slowly because his hands trembled more in cold weather now. At 72, Walter looked thinner each morning, though he tried hard to hide it behind humor and stubbornness. His silver beard had grown uneven around the chin, and dark circles beneath his eyes betrayed nights with little sleep. Yet children still wandered near his RV whenever he parked by Cedar Creek because Walter fixed broken things without charging money. He repaired bicycles, toy trucks, radios, lanterns, even a battered cassette player for a teenage boy whose father had died the year before. Some people in Ash Hollow called him strange because poverty made decent folks uncomfortable. Others quietly called him kind. Daisy suddenly stopped pacing and planted herself beside Walter's knee. Jack noticed the old man's hand pressed briefly against the left side of his chest before he quickly lowered it. The motion lasted only a second, too quick for most people. Not for Jack. "Heart bothering you?" Jack asked without looking up from the latch. Walter's screwdriver paused. "Getting old bothers me. Heart's just participating." Jack straightened slowly. That wasn't an answer. Walter gave a tired half-smile. "Doctor in Billings called it congestive heart failure 3 years ago. Sounds dramatic, doesn't it? Like a cowboy dying in an opera." Jack's jaw tightened slightly. Walter shrugged one shoulder. "Medication costs more than this RV's worth, so I ration." Daisy pushed her nose against Walter's wrist as though she understood every word. Walter scratched behind her bent ear gently. "Don't look at me like that, girl. Ain't dead yet." Snow began falling an hour later. At first, only scattered white flecks drifting through the pines. Then heavier. Then faster. By dusk, the roads outside town blurred beneath thick, swirling sheets of white. Wind hammered the mountains hard enough to rattle cabin windows. Ash Hollow disappeared beneath storm warnings and flashing emergency alerts from county radios. Jack drove Walter into town shortly before dark because the old RV would never survive the temperature drop forecast overnight. The local church on Maple Street had opened its basement as an emergency storm shelter. The church itself stood old and narrow beside the courthouse square, its wooden steeple leaning slightly after decades of mountain winters. Inside, volunteers carried blankets and steaming soup between folding cots, while frightened families crowded close together beneath fluorescent lights. Reverend Samuel Reed managed the shelter near the front entrance. Samuel was 65, tall and painfully thin, with dark skin weathered by age and kind eyes hidden behind thick glasses. Years earlier, he had lost his wife during a blizzard on an icy highway, and grief had turned him softer instead of bitter. People trusted him because he listened more than he preached. Samuel greeted Jack warmly until he noticed Daisy beside Walter. The Reverend's expression faltered. "Jack," he said carefully, "you know county regulations. We can't allow animals in the shelter area unless they're certified service dogs." Walter immediately lowered his gaze. Jack felt Daisy press lightly against his leg. "She's quiet," Jack said evenly. "Doesn't matter," Samuel sighed. "We've got children here, folks with allergies. I already argued this with county once before." Walter adjusted his old jacket slowly. "I can stay in the RV." "No, you can't," Jack answered sharply. Outside, the storm roared harder against the church windows, as if proving the point itself. Samuel rubbed tired fingers over his forehead. "I'm sorry. Truly." Jack believed him. That somehow made the situation worse, because sometimes decent people still left others out in the cold simply by following rules too carefully. Walter bent down and rested his forehead briefly against Daisy's neck. The old shepherd stayed perfectly still beside him. Jack looked around the crowded church basement. He saw mothers holding children close, elderly men wrapped in blankets pretending not to cough, volunteers trying their best. No villains, just limits. He hated limits. "Come on," Jack muttered finally. Walter blinked. "Where?" Jack grabbed Daisy's leash. "My cabin." Walter stared at him like he had misheard the language entirely. "Jack, I can't just. Storm's getting worse." Jack's voice roughened slightly. "You'll freeze in that RV."
Walter's pride flickered painfully across his face. Jack recognized it because he carried too much of the same thing himself. Samuel stepped closer.
"You sure about this?" Jack looked toward the storm outside.
"No," he admitted honestly. "But I'm doing it anyway." The drive back through the blizzard felt like crossing another planet. Snow swallowed the road so completely Jack navigated mostly by memory and instinct. Daisy sat alert between them in the truck, ears twitching at every sound. Walter remained silent most of the drive, gripping his worn knit cap tightly in both hands. The cabin looked almost buried when they arrived. Snow climbed halfway up the porch rails, and wind screamed through the pine trees behind the house. Inside, warmth returned slowly beneath the crackling wood stove. Walter stood awkwardly near the doorway, dripping melted snow onto the floorboards. "You got rules?" he asked quietly. Jack removed his coat. "Yeah. Don't touch the black gun cabinet. Don't lie about your health. And if Daisy steals my boots again, we discuss prison time." Walter barked out the first real laugh Jack had heard from him.
Daisy circled the room carefully before beginning something strange. She moved from window to window, then to the front door, then the back hallway, inspecting each space with disciplined precision. Only after checking the entire cabin did she finally settle near the stove. Walter watched her fondly. "Still guarding everybody?" "She does that every night?" Jack asked. Walter nodded slowly. "Started after a rescue mission collapsed years ago. Avalanche took 2 volunteers. Daisy kept checking tents afterward like she thought she could stop death if she stayed awake long enough." Silence settled heavily for a moment. Jack understood that feeling better than he wanted to admit. Later that night, the storm deepened. Snow hammered the roof while wind moaned through the trees like distant voices. Daisy woke several times to patrol the cabin, nails softly clicking across wooden floors before returning to lie beside Walter's cot. Around midnight, Jack awoke to a horrible smell drifting from the kitchen. He walked out half asleep and found Walter standing proudly beside a dented coffee pot. The liquid inside looked black enough to repair machinery. "Sweet Lord," Jack muttered. "Did you boil tree bark?" Walter grinned beneath his silver beard. "Army recipe." Jack poured himself a cup reluctantly. One sip nearly stopped his breathing. The coffee tasted like burned tires soaked in sorrow. He coughed violently while Walter laughed so hard he wheezed. Even Daisy approached the steaming mug, sniffed cautiously, then physically turned her head away in disgust. That finally broke something loose inside Jack Walker. Real laughter burst out of him before he could stop it, rough and rusty from years of disuse. He laughed until tears stung his eyes, while Walter leaned against the counter nearly breathless himself. Daisy stared at both men with exhausted disappointment before lying back down near the stove. Outside, the blizzard swallowed Ash Hollow beneath endless white darkness. Inside the cabin, an old soldier, a homeless veteran, and a wounded German shepherd shared terrible coffee beside a warm fire. And for one impossible moment, none of them felt entirely abandoned anymore. The storm passed during the night, but Ash Hollow woke beneath a world buried in white silence. Snow clung heavily to rooftops, pine branches sagged beneath thick frozen layers, and Cedar Creek Lake looked like a sheet of pale steel stretching beneath the winter sky. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys while plows groaned through Main Street, pushing heavy snow aside like tired old beasts. Inside Jack Walker's cabin, warmth returned slowly with the crackle of firewood and the bitter smell of Walter Hayes's infamous coffee still lingering faintly in the kitchen. Daisy lay near the stove with one eye half open, alert even in sleep.
Every so often, her bent ear twitched toward the windows, as if she still expected danger to walk through the snow at any moment. Jack stood near the sink, shaving carefully with an old military razor, while Walter sat at the kitchen table repairing a broken flashlight for a boy from town.
The old veteran's rough hands moved slower than they once had, but there remained remarkable precision in his fingers. Years of tying rescue ropes, fastening harnesses, and guiding dogs across dangerous terrain had left muscle memory buried deep inside him. "You keep fixing everybody else's junk," Jack muttered while wiping shaving cream from his jaw. "One day you ought to charge money." Walter grinned beneath his silver beard. "Then people start expecting professionalism." Daisy lifted her head briefly at the sound of laughter before settling again. For the first time in years, the cabin no longer sounded like a place built only for survival. Around noon, Jack drove Walter into town because the old man needed prescription refills from the small pharmacy beside the library. Ash Hollow looked brighter after the storm, but the beauty carried sharp edges. Icicles hung from storefront roofs like glass knives, and every sidewalk squeaked beneath frozen boots. Daisy rode in the back seat, nose resting near Walter's shoulder the entire drive, as though she feared he might disappear if left unwatched. The town library sat near the courthouse square, a small brick building with tall frosted windows and a blue-painted front door chipped by decades of mountain winters. Emily Carter stood outside brushing snow from the front steps when Jack parked nearby. Emily was 49 years old, slender and graceful in the quiet way of women who had survived sorrow without allowing it to harden them. Her chestnut brown hair rested loosely against her shoulders beneath a knitted gray hat, and faint freckles crossed her pale cheeks. She wore little makeup, carried herself gently, and spoke with the calm patience of someone accustomed to comforting grieving children. Years earlier, her husband Daniel had died from pancreatic cancer, leaving Emily alone with grief and an empty house she slowly filled with books instead of noise. Since then, she had devoted herself to the library and to helping lonely people in Ash Hollow who slipped unnoticed through everyone else's busy lives. Emily spotted Walter first. "Morning, Mr. Hayes," she called warmly. "I saved your medication package inside before the storm hit." Walter looked embarrassed immediately. "You shouldn't keep doing that, Emily. And you shouldn't skip heart medication because pride's cheaper than health care." Her smile softened the words enough to keep them kind. Then her eyes shifted toward Jack. "You must be the famous rescuer." Jack frowned slightly. "I'm not famous. Small towns disagree." Emily's gaze moved toward Daisy. "And this must be Daisy." Daisy approached cautiously, sniffing Emily's gloved hand before allowing a brief scratch behind the ear. Emily smiled sadly. "Poor girl. You can always tell when an animal's been disappointed by people." Jack studied her quietly. Most folks in Ash Hollow spoke too loudly around pain, as though kindness required performance. Emily did not. That alone made him uneasy in ways he could not explain. Inside the pharmacy, Walter quietly collected his medication while Jack waited near the square with Daisy beside him. Across the street, workers continued decorating for the Veterans Remembrance Festival. Large sponsor banners now hung beside the courthouse steps, displaying the Vail Mountain Resort logo beneath slogans about community and honor. Jack disliked the sight more each day. A low engine suddenly rolled through the square. Heads turned immediately. A polished black Range Rover glided through the snow and stopped near the fountain. Richard Coleman stepped out first, wearing a charcoal overcoat and expensive leather gloves untouched by winter slush. He looked composed as always, dark hair neatly styled, sharp jaw clean-shaven, every detail arranged to project authority. But today another woman climbed out beside him. Vanessa Price was younger than Sarah Whitmore, perhaps 32, tall and striking with long platinum blonde hair flowing over a white fur-lined coat. Her makeup was flawless, even in the cold, and she moved with the practiced confidence of someone who understood cameras better than people. Vanessa had once been a regional television lifestyle host before fading fame attached her to wealthy men instead. She smiled beautifully without warmth ever reaching her pale blue eyes. A cameraman followed them from the SUV carrying professional equipment through the snow. Richard spotted Daisy instantly. His smile sharpened. "Well," he said smoothly, loud enough for nearby townspeople to hear. "There's my dog." Daisy froze beside Jack's leg. The fur along her back stiffened visibly. Walter emerged from the pharmacy just in time to hear the words. Richard spread his hands theatrically toward the small crowd beginning to gather. "I appreciate everyone looking after Lady during the storm." Walter's face darkened immediately at the false name. Daisy backed away the moment Richard stepped closer. Vanessa crouched slightly near the cameraman. "Get this angle," she whispered softly. "Concerned owner reunited with lost rescue dog." Jack's jaw tightened. Richard extended one gloved hand toward Daisy. "Come here, lady." Daisy did not move. Instead, she retreated directly behind Walter Hayes, pressing tightly against the old veteran's legs. The entire square seemed to pause. Walter rested one trembling hand gently against Daisy's neck. "Her name's Daisy," he said quietly. Richard's pleasant expression thinned. "Legally, she belongs to me." Jack stepped forward slightly. "Funny way to treat property, throwing it into a ditch." Vanessa's camera operator shifted nervously. Richard recovered instantly, smiling again for the gathering crowd. "Mister." Walker seems confused about what he witnessed during dangerous weather conditions. Daisy suddenly let out a low, frightened sound deep in her throat when Richard reached toward her again. She ducked farther behind Walter, trembling visibly. Nearby townspeople exchanged uncertain looks. Emily Carter stood near the library steps holding a box of returned books against her chest. Her expression hardened as she watched Daisy recoil from Richard's touch. Vanessa quickly motioned for the cameraman to stop recording, but it was too late. A teenage boy named Caleb Morris had already lifted his phone from across the square. Caleb was 16, lanky and awkward, with curly dark hair falling over thick glasses. Ever since losing his older brother in a drunk driving accident 2 years earlier, Caleb filmed nearly everything around town as if terrified memories might disappear if left uncaptured. He kept recording quietly while Daisy hid behind Walter like a frightened child. Richard noticed too late. "Turn that off," Vanessa snapped sharply. But Caleb stepped backward. "It's a public square." Daisy refused to leave Walter's side. No commands worked, no coaxing softened her fear. And slowly, beneath the fluttering festival banners and falling snow, people in Ash Hollow began noticing the difference between a dog greeting someone she loved and a dog hiding from someone she feared. Richard's polished smile finally cracked for one dangerous second before he turned sharply toward the SUV. "This conversation isn't over," he said coldly. Walter watched him leave while Daisy remained pressed tightly against his leg. The cameraman lowered his equipment awkwardly. Vanessa climbed back into the SUV without another word. The vehicle disappeared down Main Street beneath a spray of dirty snow. Silence lingered for a moment afterward. Then Caleb looked down at the video on his phone. "People should probably see this," he murmured. Jack glanced toward Daisy. The old shepherd finally relaxed slightly once the SUV vanished from sight. Emily stepped closer quietly. "Animals don't fake fear," she said softly. Across the square, several townspeople had already begun whispering to one another beneath the festival banners bearing Richard Coleman's name.
The video spread through Ash Hollow faster than the storm itself. By the next morning, nearly everyone in town had seen the shaky footage of Daisy shrinking behind Walter Hayes, while Richard Coleman stood smiling stiffly beneath the Veterans Remembrance Festival banners. Some people watched it once and dismissed it. Others replayed it quietly in their kitchens, while snow drifted against their windows. In small towns, doubt traveled like smoke, slow at first, then suddenly everywhere. Jack Walker noticed the change the moment he stepped into Murphy's general store that afternoon. Conversations lowered when he entered. A few people nodded respectfully. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Fear and admiration often looked similar from a distance. Daisy walked close beside him, her black and tan coat thickening against the deepening winter cold. Though her body had grown stronger, she still startled whenever large engines passed too close or unfamiliar men raised their voices. Walter Hayes followed a few steps behind, carrying a box of canned soup. The store owner insisted he take without paying. Walter hated charity with a passion sharpened by pride, but age and exhaustion had slowly taught him that refusing kindness sometimes wounded the giver more than the receiver. But Murphy himself stood near the register, polishing his glasses nervously. Earl Murphy was 68, short and round-shouldered, with a grey mustache stained permanently yellow by decades of cigarettes he no longer smoked. Years earlier, his son had died overseas in Afghanistan, and since then, Earl treated every veteran in Ash Hollow with quiet protectiveness that bordered on guilt. "Town's buzzing," Earl muttered softly while pretending to rearrange receipts. "Richard's furious." Jack adjusted the grocery bag under his arm. "Good." Earl lowered his voice further. "Careful, son. Men like him don't swing fists. They close wallets." The warning lingered heavily between them, because everybody understood what it meant. Vale Mountain Resort funded half the festival decorations, donated money to the church roof repairs, and promised jobs once the luxury cabins opened in spring. Richard Coleman had wrapped himself around Ash Hollow's economy like ivy, around an old tree. Pulling him loose now threatened to crack the bark underneath. Outside, Walter tightened his coat against the wind. Daisy suddenly stopped near the sidewalk, outside the resort's marketing office, downtown. Her ears flattened instantly. Jack followed her gaze. Through the frosted front windows stood several staged holiday displays prepared for festival tourists. One display caught his attention immediately. Expensive leather dog collars hanging beside framed promotional photographs of smiling couples with golden retrievers beside mountain fireplaces. Daisy's breathing changed. Not loud, not panicked, but wrong. Jack crouched beside her carefully. He noticed her eyes fixed on a narrow metal kennel, partially visible through an open storage room door inside the building. The shepherd backed away at once. Walter saw it too. The old veteran's face tightened with sudden understanding. "That's where they kept her," he said quietly. Jack looked at him sharply. Walter swallowed hard. "Richard said they needed Daisy for publicity shoots. Said guests trusted resorts that looked family-friendly. Snow drifted slowly around them, while traffic moved quietly through Main Street." Walter stared toward the kennel inside the building. At first she stayed inside the lodge. "Then one day I visited and found her locked in a back room because she snapped at a photographer who grabbed her too hard." His weathered hands trembled slightly. She hated confined spaces after that. Daisy pressed herself against Walter's leg, without taking her eyes off the building. Jack's jaw hardened dangerously. "How long?" Walter rubbed tired fingers across his beard. "Couple weeks, maybe." Sometimes longer during photo campaigns. She stopped eating regular after that. Jack glanced again at the kennel through the glass. Something dark and heavy stirred deep inside him. Something old from places overseas where living things became tools for powerful men. He hated that feeling because rage had once nearly destroyed him. Daisy suddenly limped away from the storefront, as though even the scent of the place hurt her. Walter followed slowly. "I thought giving her up meant safety," he whispered. "Didn't know I was handing her to people who only loved appearances." Later that afternoon, the town council announced that Richard Coleman had withdrawn a large portion of his sponsorship money from the Veterans Remembrance Festival due to recent misunderstandings damaging community partnerships. The statement appeared polite on paper. In reality, it landed like a threat dropped quietly onto every doorstep in Ash Hollow. Decorations disappeared from Main Street by evening. Volunteers argued outside the courthouse over whether the festival should be cancelled entirely. Tyler Brooks looked pale during the emergency meeting, his polished confidence cracking under pressure. Jack avoided the town hall crowd and drove Walter home through falling snow. Emily Carter arrived shortly afterward, carrying fresh bread and 2 paper bags filled with groceries. She stepped inside the cabin with cold pink cheeks and loose strands of brown hair escaping beneath her knitted scarf. "The town's unraveling already," she sighed, while setting the bags down. "People are scared the resort project will collapse." Walter snorted softly. Funny how fear always arrives dressed as practicality. Emily smiled sadly at that. Daisy greeted her gently now, nudging Emily's hand before returning to lie near the fireplace. Trust came slowly to wounded creatures, but Emily's calmness seemed to soothe her. While Walter unpacked groceries, Emily quietly approached Jack near the wood stove. "You look tired," she murmured. Jack shrugged automatically. "Didn't sleep much." Emily studied him carefully. "Nightmares?" The question struck closer than he expected. Jack stared into the fire too long before answering. "Sometimes." Emily nodded softly, as though she understood more than he said aloud. Her husband Daniel had screamed in his sleep during the final months of cancer treatment, haunted by pain, medication, dreams, and fear. Neither of them could stop. Since losing him, Emily recognized exhaustion, hidden behind silence. Walter eventually settled into the old armchair beside the fire, while snow whispered softly against the cabin windows. Daisy rested near his boots, though every few minutes her eyes drifted back toward Jack, as if checking whether he remained steady.
"Helen used to hate winter,"
Walter said suddenly. Jack glanced over. The old veteran smiled faintly into the flames. "Said snow made the world too quiet, like God forgot to keep talking." Jack remained silent. Walter continued, anyway. "Met her after the Gulf War. I drank too much back then, mean drunk too." His lined face darkened briefly with memory. "One night, she found me passed out behind a VFW hall in Wyoming. Instead of leaving, she sat beside me in the cold till morning, because she figured dead men deserved company too." Emily lowered her eyes quietly. Walter chuckled sadly. "Married her 6 months later. Smartest thing either of us ever did." Daisy lifted her head when Walter's voice trembled. He scratched behind her ears slowly. "After Helen died, this girl here gave me a reason to get out of bed again." Jack watched the old man carefully. There were no dramatic tears, just exhaustion, the kind built over years of losing pieces of yourself, one funeral at a time. That night, the wind rose hard outside the cabin, again. Long after Walter and Emily had gone to sleep, Jack sat alone near the dying fire, staring into darkness while Daisy rested nearby. Sleep eventually dragged him under against his will. Then came the dream. Sandstorms. Gunfire. Mick Harper screaming somewhere beyond smoke, blood-soaking desert gravel beneath trembling hands. Jack jerked awake violently, breathing hard, sweat cold against his neck despite the winter air. For one terrible second, he did not know where he was. The cabin returned slowly around him through darkness and firelight. His hands still shook. Then something warm touched his knee. Daisy stood beside the chair, watching him quietly. No fear, no caution, no care. Slowly, with the careful gentleness of a creature offering trust for the first time, the German Shepherd rested her head across Jack Walker's knee. Jack froze. Daisy's amber eyes stayed fixed on him, as though she understood broken things, recognized each other eventually. Outside, snow drifted softly across Ash Hollow beneath the dark Montana sky, while inside the cabin, a wounded dog finally chose the man she believed might never abandon her. Ash Hollow no longer sounded like the same town. Winter had settled heavily over the valley now, covering rooftops and frozen roads beneath layers of white, but the cold outside felt gentler than the tension growing between neighbors indoors. At Murphy's General Store, conversations stopped when certain people entered. At the diner near Main Street, tables quietly separated themselves into invisible camps. Some townspeople defended Richard Coleman because the resort promised jobs their families desperately needed. Others avoided speaking publicly, but nodded respectfully whenever Jack Walker or Walter Hayes passed by with Daisy. Small towns often prided themselves on unity until fear arrived, carrying bills and mortgage payments. Then, loyalty became expensive. That Monday morning, Jack stood outside his cabin, tightening chains around the truck tires while Walter worked beneath the old RV near the woodshed. The RV looked even sadder against the snow now, its faded blue paint peeling like old skin beneath rust spots and salt damage. Yet Walter attacked the repairs with determined patience. The old veteran wore fingerless gloves, despite the cold, because thick gloves made it harder for his stiff hands to handle tools properly. A portable heater hummed weakly nearby, while Daisy lay beside him, watching every movement, as if supervising the repair itself. Transmission lines nearly gone, Walter muttered from beneath the vehicle. Radiator too. Jack wiped grease from his hands. Then why bother fixing it? Walter slid out slowly, wincing from pain in his knee and chest before hiding both behind a grin. Because broken things deserve at least one honest attempt. Daisy nudged Walter's shoulder gently. Jack watched them quietly. Since the night of his nightmare, Daisy had changed around him. She no longer kept cautious distance inside the cabin. Sometimes he woke to find her sleeping beside his chair rather than Walter's cot. She still loved Walter with fierce loyalty, but something deeper had begun growing between the wounded shepherd and the old Navy SEAL, who understood silence too well. Around noon, Emily Carter called, asking if Jack could bring Daisy to the library. "I'm hosting a reading hour for children," she explained over the phone. "The theme is loyalty and kindness. And honestly," her voice softened slightly, "some folks in town need reminding." Jack almost refused automatically. Crowds still tightened something uncomfortable inside him. But Daisy lifted her head the moment Emily's name left the phone speaker, ears twitching attentively. Walter smirked beneath his silver beard. "Dog already made the decision for you." The library smelled of old paper, cinnamon tea, and melting snow from children's boots lined near the doorway. Emily had rearranged the reading corner with blankets and lantern-shaped decorations left over from the festival supplies. About a dozen children sat cross-legged on the floor, waiting expectantly. Daisy entered carefully beside Jack, her movements alert but calmer than before. Several younger children froze immediately at the sight of the large German Shepherd. One little girl hid partly behind a bookshelf. Emily knelt beside Daisy first, gently stroking her neck. "This," she told the children softly, "is Daisy. She's learning how to trust people again." The room quieted. Daisy glanced toward Jack before slowly settling beside Emily's chair. Emily began reading from an old illustrated book about rescue dogs in the mountains. Her voice carried warmth that filled spaces people often forgot were empty. Jack remained near the back wall, arms folded tightly, uncomfortable beneath attention yet unable to leave. Then something unexpected happened. A small boy with curly blonde hair quietly crawled closer to Daisy. He could not have been older than 7. His name was Noah Bennett, though most of Ash Hollow barely knew him because he rarely spoke. Noah was autistic, and after his father abandoned the family 2 years earlier, he had retreated even deeper into silence. His mother, Claire Bennett, sat nervously near the doorway, watching every movement carefully. Claire was 34, exhausted-looking but gentle, with tired green eyes and dark hair tied loosely beneath a wool cap. Years of raising Noah alone had carved permanent worry into her posture. "It's okay," Emily whispered softly to her. Noah extended one trembling hand toward Daisy. The German shepherd remained perfectly still. Slowly, Noah touched the fur behind her bent ear. Daisy closed her eyes briefly. Then, to everyone's surprise, her tail thumped softly once against the floorboards. The children gasped with delight. For the next half hour, Daisy allowed small, careful touches from the children, while Emily continued reading stories about loyalty and rescue dogs. Jack watched from across the room, feeling something unfamiliar stir beneath his ribs. Peace, maybe. Or grief softening enough to resemble it. Emily eventually approached him quietly, while the children gathered around Daisy. "You know," she murmured, "she watches you the way people watch lighthouses during storms." Jack stared toward the floor. "Lighthouses don't usually feel lost themselves." Emily smiled sadly. "Most of them probably do." Outside the library, Ash Hollow's division deepened by evening. Flyers suddenly appeared on several storefronts, warning that outside troublemakers threatened the future of the resort project. Rumors spread that Richard Coleman might cancel additional construction phases if the town kept supporting Walter Hayes publicly. Tyler Brooks scheduled an emergency town meeting that night at the courthouse hall, hoping to calm tensions before the festival collapsed completely. The courthouse filled quickly after sunset. Farmers in heavy coats sat beside shop owners, teachers, retired veterans, and worried parents. Snow blew hard against the windows while arguments simmered long before the meeting officially began. Jack arrived reluctantly, with Walter and Daisy beside him. Conversations shifted immediately. Richard Coleman stood near the front row wearing another perfectly tailored dark coat. Vanessa Price sat beside him, elegant and expressionless, scrolling through her phone as though the entire town existed only as background scenery. Tyler Brooks attempted a welcoming speech, but tension cracked through the room almost instantly. Richard stood smoothly when given the floor. "Ash Hollow deserves stability," he announced confidently. "Not emotional reactions based on misunderstandings." Murmurs spread across the room. Richard's expression remained calm, practiced. "I sympathize with veterans struggling to adjust after military service." Jack's eyes narrowed immediately. "But," Richard continued carefully, "certain individuals may project trauma onto situations they misunderstand." The room went still. Jack rose slowly from his chair. Every instinct from years in combat told him to move carefully now. Daisy pressed close beside his leg. Richard smiled faintly. "Mr. Walker, with respect, combat veterans sometimes experience emotional instability connected to rescue fantasies and—" "Finish that sentence," Jack said quietly. His voice remained calm enough to frighten people more than shouting would have. Walter stood too, placing one hand lightly on Jack's arm. Around the hall, people shifted uneasily. Emily Carter rose from the back row. "Daisy's fear wasn't imagined," she said firmly. Claire Bennett nodded beside her. Then, something remarkable happened. Noah Bennett, still sitting beside his mother near the aisle, suddenly stood up, clutching one of Daisy's shed tufts of fur in his small, mittened hand. The little boy looked directly toward Richard Coleman and spoke clearly enough for the entire courthouse to hear. "Doggy scared of mean man." Silence swallowed the room. Claire covered her mouth in shock because Noah had barely spoken in public for nearly a year. Daisy quietly crossed the aisle and rested beside Noah's chair. People stared not at Richard now, but at the frightened little boy, calmly petting the old German shepherd. Something shifted inside Ash Hollow at that moment. Not completely. Not enough to end the conflict, but enough for doubt to stop belonging. Only to whispers. The mountain road above Vale Mountain Resort had always carried a dangerous beauty in winter. Narrow cliffs twisted beside deep pine valleys, and after heavy snowfall the entire pass seemed to balance between silence and disaster. By late January, fresh snow buried the upper ridges in unstable layers, thick enough to worry even experienced locals. Jack Walker noticed the signs immediately. Wind had shifted sharply overnight, packing loose powder across the slopes above the resort access road. The air itself felt tense, brittle somehow, like glass waiting for a crack. Early that morning, Daisy refused to settle inside the cabin. The German shepherd paced restlessly between the windows and the front door, ears alert, tail stiff. Every few minutes she gave a low, uneasy sound deep in her throat while staring toward the mountain ridge above town. Walter Hayes sat near the fire wearing 2 sweaters beneath his old army jacket, trying unsuccessfully to hide the strain in his breathing. The cold worsened his heart condition, though pride kept him from admitting how much. He was 72 now, thin as weathered rope, silver beard, rough around his jaw. But his sharp brown eyes still carried the instincts of a rescue handler who had once spent years searching mountains for buried survivors. Daisy suddenly froze beside the porch door. Then she barked once loud, sharp, urgent. Jack immediately looked up from cleaning the truck chains. "What is it?" Daisy pawed hard at the door. Walter's face changed instantly. "She hears something." Jack frowned toward the storm-gray mountains. At first, he heard nothing except wind through the pines. Then, far off in the distance, came a dull sound rolling across the valley. Not thunder. He knew too well what it was. Avalanche. Daisy bolted outside the moment Jack opened the door. Snow sprayed beneath her paws as she sprinted toward the truck. Jack grabbed his coat immediately. "Road above the resort," Walter muttered, already struggling painfully to his feet. Jack glanced at him. "You stay here." Walter gave him a look, sharp enough to cut rope. "Son, I trained avalanche dogs before your knees started hurting in the morning." Jack hesitated only 1 second before nodding. The drive toward Vale Mountain turned vicious quickly. Snow whipped sideways across the windshield while emergency sirens echoed faintly from town below. Halfway up the mountain road, they encountered abandoned vehicles already buried beneath drifting snow. Daisy stood in the back seat, trembling with restless urgency. The moment Jack stopped near the collapsed section of road, she leapt out into waist-deep snow and began searching immediately. The avalanche had torn down nearly half the mountainside. Broken trees jutted from packed snow like shattered bones. Part of the resort maintenance road had vanished completely beneath tons of ice and debris. Workers stumbled through the chaos, shouting names into the wind. One injured man sat against a snowbank, clutching a bleeding shoulder, while another tried desperately to dig with bare hands near a crushed equipment truck. Richard Coleman's black SUV lay half-buried sideways against a fallen pine. Jack moved instantly into command without realizing it. Years in combat returned automatically whenever lives depended on calm. "You," he barked toward 2 stunned workers. "Get shovels from the maintenance shed. Move fast." The men obeyed before thinking. Walter limped heavily through the snow beside Daisy, despite obvious pain tightening his chest. The old veteran's breathing sounded rough, but his eyes stayed sharp and focused. Snow settled uneven. Walter shouted over the wind. "Air pockets'll form beneath the lower drift." Daisy suddenly barked twice and began clawing frantically near a buried section of road. Jack dropped beside her and started digging with gloved hands until another worker arrived with a shovel. Beneath the snow emerged a young resort electrician named Miguel Alvarez. Miguel was 26, broad-shouldered with dark, curly hair, plastered against his forehead by melting snow. Blood streaked one side of his face, but he remained conscious. "There's more," he gasped weakly. "3 more trapped lower down." Richard, too. Walter immediately looked toward the collapsed ridge. Secondary slide could happen any minute. Jack helped Miguel toward safer ground, while Daisy kept searching restlessly. Around them, panic spread through the workers. Some wanted to retreat entirely before another avalanche hit. Others shouted conflicting instructions. Fear always made crowds dangerous. Down in Ash Hollow, Emily Carter had already transformed Reverend Samuel Reed's church basement into an emergency rescue center. Tables filled with blankets, hot soup, medical kits, and radios lined the walls beneath harsh fluorescent lights. Emily moved steadily through the chaos, carrying supplies and comforting frightened families. Though her hands trembled slightly from fear, her voice remained calm. That was Emily's strength. She made frightened people feel less alone without pretending danger wasn't real. Claire Bennett arrived with Noah shortly after hearing about the avalanche. Earl Murphy delivered canned food from the general store, while Tyler Brooks nervously coordinated phone calls with county emergency crews. For the first time since the town divided, people stopped arguing long enough to work side by side again. Back on the mountain, Walter suddenly staggered hard against the snowbank. Jack caught him instantly. "Chest," Jack demanded. Walter nodded once, face pale beneath his beard. Pain flickered openly across his features now. "I'm fine." "That's a lie." Walter gripped Jack's sleeve tightly. "Listen to me. Daisy's circling the lower drift because somebody's alive down there." Jack looked toward the shepherd. Sure enough, Daisy kept moving back repeatedly toward one particular mound of packed snow. Her barking changed, now shorter, sharper, focused. Walter forced himself upright, despite trembling legs. "That's alert behavior." She found scent. Jack swallowed hard and started digging beside Daisy. 2 workers joined him while snow blasted across the mountainside. Every breath burned in the freezing air. Minutes passed. Then, one of the shovels struck metal. Beneath the drift lay part of Richard Coleman's crushed SUV roof. Daisy barked wildly now, digging harder with bleeding paws. Jack ripped the passenger door open enough to reach inside. Empty. Then Daisy darted farther downslope and began clawing frantically again near a collapsed tree. Walter's eyes widened. He got thrown clear. Together, they dug through nearly 4 feet of snow before Jack finally uncovered a gloved hand. Richard Coleman lay unconscious beneath the drift, blood frozen along one side of his forehead. Snow had packed tightly around his chest and legs. For one terrible second, Jack hesitated. Images flashed through his mind, Daisy trembling beside the resort kennel, Walter losing his only companion, Richard smiling coldly while accusing him publicly. The old anger rose hot and dangerous inside him. Then Daisy pushed forward immediately, whining desperately beside Richard's buried body. Despite everything done to her, the old German shepherd had still searched until she found him. Jack stared at Daisy in disbelief. Animals often understood mercy better than people. "Help me lift him," Jack ordered quietly. Walter nodded weakly beside him, chest heaving painfully. Together they pulled Richard free just as another deep cracking sound echoed high above the ridge. Secondary slide. "Move!" Jack shouted. Workers scrambled downhill through blowing snow while Daisy stayed tight beside Walter's legs. Jack half-carried Richard across the unstable slope toward the rescue trucks below. Behind them, snow thundered down the mountainside again, swallowing trees and debris in roaring white violence. By the time they reached safety, emergency crews from Billings finally arrived, flashing red lights across the storm. Emily stood near the ambulance line below the mountain when Jack emerged, carrying Richard Coleman through the snow. Her eyes widened in shock. Daisy limped behind them, exhausted and ice-covered, yet still watching carefully to ensure nobody got left behind again. Paramedics rushed Richard onto a stretcher, while Walter sank heavily against the side of the truck, clutching his chest. Jack knelt beside Daisy in the swirling snow. The old shepherd leaned briefly into him, breathing hard. "You saved him," Jack whispered quietly, almost unable to understand it himself. Daisy closed her tired amber eyes for a moment, while snow drifted softly across her scarred fur. The avalanche changed Ash Hollow in ways no storm ever had. For days afterward, the town moved more quietly, as if people had suddenly remembered how fragile life became beneath enough snow and darkness. Vale Mountain Resort suspended all construction temporarily while investigators inspected the damaged road, and the footage of Daisy helping rescue trapped workers spread far beyond the town itself. Local news stations replayed images of the aging German shepherd standing beside exhausted rescue crews with snow frozen across her fur and blood on her paws. People who had once whispered that Walter Hayes was a strange old drifter now stopped him on the sidewalks to shake his hand. Children waved at Daisy from passing trucks. Even Earl Murphy placed a small handwritten sign near the register at his store that read, "Coffee free for rescue workers' dogs included." Yet the biggest change settled quietly inside the hospital room, where Richard Coleman finally opened his eyes. The private room overlooked Cedar Creek beneath a pale winter sky. Machines beeped softly beside the bed, while late afternoon light spilled across the blankets, covering Richard's bruised body. A deep cut crossed one side of his forehead, and his left arm remained wrapped heavily after being crushed beneath snow and debris during the avalanche. For the first time since Jack Walker had known him, Richard looked small. Not weak, exactly. Just stripped of polish. Vanessa Price sat near the window, scrolling silently through messages on her phone, while a bouquet of expensive flowers filled the room with sharp, artificial perfume. She looked exhausted despite her flawless makeup. Platinum hair tied tightly behind her head, pale blue eyes carrying the irritation of someone inconvenienced by tragedy rather than changed by it. Richard stared blankly toward the ceiling for a long moment before speaking. "Who found me?" Vanessa hesitated. "Search crews." Richard turned his head slowly toward her. "That's not what I asked." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Vanessa sighed softly and lowered the phone. The dog did. Something flickered across Richard's face then. "Bye. Not gratitude. Not yet. Something harder. Shame. Perhaps." He remembered flashes now through the haze of pain medication. Snow crushing down around him, suffocating cold, darkness pressing against his chest. And somewhere through that darkness he remembered hearing barking. Persistent. Refusing to stop. Richard closed his eyes tightly. "She stayed?" Vanessa nodded once. "According to the rescuers, Daisy kept digging until they found you." The room grew painfully quiet. Richard had spent most of his adult life believing loyalty could be purchased, trained, branded, and displayed like any luxury product. Yet the creature he had discarded beside a frozen roadside had still chosen to save his life. Some truths arrived gently. Others broke through pride like avalanches through timber. Across town, Walter Hayes stood before a packed gathering inside the church hall for the first public town meeting since the rescue. Snow still covered the roads outside, but nearly everyone in Ash Hollow had come. Farmers sat beside teachers, construction workers beside shop owners. Reverend Samuel Reed quietly poured coffee near the back, while Tyler Brooks nervously shuffled paperwork that no longer seemed important. Daisy rested beside Walter's chair throughout the meeting, calm now, her old amber eyes watching the room without fear. Walter himself looked exhausted. The avalanche and strain on his heart had weakened him noticeably. His silver beard appeared thinner against his pale face, and every breath carried faint effort, though stubbornness still held his shoulders upright. Jack stood nearby, leaning against the wall, while Emily Carter sat close enough to steady Walter if needed. Emily wore a dark wool sweater and no makeup tonight, her chestnut hair loose around tired eyes that had spent days helping injured workers and frightened families at the church shelter. Yet even exhausted, she carried warmth into rooms the way lanterns carried light into winter cabins. Walter cleared his throat slowly. "Most folks here know pieces of the story already," he began quietly. The hall fell, completely silent. "But maybe it's time people heard the ugly parts too." Daisy lifted her head slightly at his voice. Walter spoke for nearly 20 minutes. He told them about meeting Daisy years earlier, during a mountain rescue training exercise. How she learned commands faster than any dog he had ever handled. How after Helen died, Daisy became the reason he still woke up each morning instead of drinking himself into the grave. He admitted with visible shame how fear and pressure from county officials pushed him into giving her to Richard Coleman. "I told myself she'd be safer warm inside that resort," Walter whispered roughly. "Truth is, I was scared of losing the only home I had left." No one interrupted him. Several people lowered their eyes quietly, because they recognized that kind of fear in themselves. Walter finally rested one trembling hand against Daisy's neck. "Thing about dogs," he said softly, "is they don't measure people the way we do. They don't care who's rich, or proud, or broken. They just remember who leaves them behind, and who comes back." The room stayed silent long after he finished speaking. Jack noticed Tyler Brooks staring toward the floor with visible guilt. The young mayor had spent months chasing sponsorships and headlines, while forgetting the actual purpose of the Veterans Remembrance Festival. Now even he looked ashamed of how easily money had twisted the town against its own people. After the meeting ended, snow drifted softly through the church parking lot beneath yellow streetlights. Emily walked beside Jack, while Daisy moved ahead through the fresh powder, and Walter slowly followed behind them. "You should have heard yourself in there," Emily said quietly. Jack glanced sideways. "I didn't say much." "Exactly." She smiled faintly. "You stopped hiding." The words stayed with him long after they returned to the cabin. That night, Jack finally climbed into the attic storage space above the living room for the first time in years. Dust floated through flashlight beams, while old military boxes sat untouched beneath heavy blankets. Daisy followed him carefully up the narrow ladder, settling nearby while he opened a weathered trunk. Inside lay photographs he had not looked at since Mick Harper died. Younger faces stared back at him from desert camps and aircraft decks. Men grinning despite exhaustion. Men who never came home. Jack sat silently on the attic floor for a long time, holding one particular photograph of Mick leaning against a helicopter with his ridiculous crooked smile. For years, Jack had hidden every reminder because grief felt safer buried. But buried things still rotted beneath the surface. Downstairs, Emily helped Walter organize medication beside the kitchen table, while snow tapped gently against the windows. Walter noticed when Jack finally descended, carrying several framed photographs beneath one arm. "Well, I'll be damned," Walter murmured softly. Jack hung the first frame above the fireplace without speaking. Daisy watched him carefully the entire time. Later, when the cabin grew quiet and Walter drifted asleep in the armchair, Daisy moved between both men throughout the evening. She rested beside Walter while he coughed weakly into a blanket. Then later she crossed the room and settled beside Jack's boots while he stared thoughtfully into the fire. It was as though the old shepherd refused to belong to only one wounded soul. She guarded them both equally now. Near midnight, a snow-covered county courier truck stopped outside the cabin briefly before disappearing back down the road. Jack opened the front door and found a sealed envelope resting on the porch rail. No name written outside. Only Walter's address. Walter opened it slowly beneath the kitchen light, while Daisy watched closely beside him. Inside rested every official ownership document for Daisy, bearing Richard Coleman's signature at the bottom. No letter, no explanation, no apology. Just signatures transferring full ownership permanently back to Walter Hayes. The old veteran stared at the papers silently for several seconds before lowering himself heavily into the chair. His rough hands trembled harder now than during the avalanche. Daisy walked over quietly and rested her head against his knee. Walter swallowed once, eyes glistening beneath the kitchen light. Outside, snow continued falling softly across Ash Hollow, while inside the cabin, a proud old man finally understood that sometimes the deepest apologies arrived without words, because shame itself had already knelt first. By mid-February, the snow around Ash Hollow no longer carried the same heaviness it had earlier that winter. The mountains still stood buried beneath white ridges, and Cedar Creek Lake still groaned softly beneath thick ice during the night. But something warmer had begun moving quietly through the town. Perhaps it was relief after the avalanche. Perhaps it was shame, settling into kindness. Or perhaps it was simply what happened when frightened people finally remembered they belonged to one another before they belonged to money. The Veterans Remembrance Festival returned slowly to life during the final week before the ceremony. This time there were no giant resort banners hanging over Main Street, no polished advertisements promising luxury cabins or investment opportunities. Instead, the people of Ash Hollow built everything themselves. Farmers hauled lumber into town using old pickup trucks. Teenagers climbed ladders to string yellow lanterns between rooftops. Mothers baked pies and soup for volunteers working in the cold. Along the courthouse lawn, dozens of framed photographs appeared beneath handmade wooden stands. Young soldiers in faded uniforms, smiling sailors beside ships, women in combat fatigues holding helmets beneath desert suns. Some had returned home, old and gray. Others remained forever, 22 years old, behind dusty glass frames. Jack Walker helped construct the stage near the center of the square, 3 mornings in a row. He worked mostly in silence beside local carpenters, while Daisy wandered calmly through the crowd, accepting gentle pats from townspeople who once feared her. Children now ran toward her instead of away from her. Jack noticed how naturally Daisy adjusted herself around people now, careful not to overwhelm frightened children or elderly veterans moving slowly with canes. Trauma had not made her cruel, only cautious. Emily Carter arrived every morning carrying coffee in a large thermos and stacks of books tucked beneath one arm. Her cheeks stayed pink from the cold, and loose strands of chestnut hair escaped constantly from beneath her knitted cap whenever wind swept through the square. She had begun laughing more these past weeks, though grief still lived quietly behind her green eyes, like old winter hidden beneath spring snow. Jack found himself waiting for those small laughs, now in ways that unsettled him. One afternoon, while hammering planks beneath the stage, Jack glanced up and saw Emily kneeling beside Daisy near a group of children outside the library. The old German shepherd lay calmly, while 3 little girls decorated her collar with tiny paper hearts, cut from colored construction paper. Daisy tolerated the entire indignity with exhausted patience. "You're staring," Walter Hayes muttered from nearby. Jack nearly missed the nail completely. Walter sat bundled in blankets atop a folding chair, supervising everyone with the authority of a retired king who refused to admit he could barely feel his knees anymore. His face looked thinner these days, his skin pale beneath the silver beard, but the warmth returning to his eyes made him seem stronger somehow. "Mind your own business," Jack grunted. Walter grinned slowly. That stopped being entertaining years ago. The old veteran had become something unexpected around Cedar Creek over the past month. Children now knocked on his RV door asking him to repair sleds, radios, broken skates, and toy trucks. Elderly widows brought him soup containers while pretending they simply made too much. Teenagers stopped to listen to his rescue stories near the lake during afternoons. Somehow Walter Hayes, the lonely old man once dismissed as strange, had quietly become everyone's grandfather, without realizing it himself. Even Noah Bennett visited almost daily now with Daisy. The little boy still spoke rarely, but around the German shepherd he no longer seemed trapped inside silence. Sometimes he simply sat beside her for an hour, while she rested her head against his small shoulder. Claire Bennett often cried privately afterward, because she had not seen peace settle over her son like that in years. A few days before the festival, Emily and Jack organized a reading program at the library for children, focused on rescue dogs and lonely veterans. Jack hated public speaking almost as much as he hated crowds, but Emily insisted people trusted him now. "That's unfortunate judgment on their part," he muttered while helping arrange chairs. Emily laughed softly. "You know, for someone people describe as intimidating, you complain like an 80-year-old fisherman." The reading room filled quickly. Families crowded near the bookshelves while Daisy lay stretched across the rug, surrounded by children holding illustrated dog stories. Jack read awkwardly at first, his deep, rough voice sounding more suited for military commands than children's books. But slowly, he relaxed. Daisy kept wandering between the children and the older veterans, sitting quietly near the walls, as though she understood exactly who needed comfort most. One old Marine named Leonard Briggs sat silently in the back row throughout the event. Leonard was 77, tall but stooped now with age, his once powerful shoulders weakened by arthritis and old injuries from Vietnam. Thick white eyebrows, shadowed eyes that rarely looked directly at people anymore. After losing his wife the previous year, Leonard barely left his house, except for doctor appointments. Yet when Daisy approached him quietly during the reading and rested her muzzle against his hand, something fragile softened across the old Marine's face. "Smart dog," Leonard whispered hoarsely while stroking her fur. "Knows broken soldiers when she sees them." Jack overheard the words from across the room and understood them too well. Festival night finally arrived beneath a sky full of drifting snow and golden lantern light. Main Street glowed warmly against the winter darkness, while music floated softly across the square from local musicians, playing old folk songs and military hymns. Families gathered beneath blankets, drinking hot cider, while children carried paper lanterns through the snow. For the first time in years, Ash Hollow felt less like a struggling mountain town and more like a family remembering itself. Walter Hayes stood behind the stage curtain, wearing his cleanest flannel shirt beneath his old army coat. His hands trembled badly tonight. Not from cold, from fear. "You faced avalanches," Jack reminded him quietly. "It's just people." Walter gave him a dry look. "Avalanches don't clap politely while judging your breathing." Daisy sat between them, watching carefully. When Walter's name was announced, the entire square applauded loudly enough to echo off the snowy rooftops. Walter walked slowly to the microphone beneath strings of warm yellow lanterns. For a moment he simply stared at the crowd before him. Townspeople, children, veterans, widows, workers, teachers. people who had once overlooked him entirely. Snow drifted gently through the light around his silver beard. Spent a lot of years thinking loneliness was permanent. Walter began softly. The crowd quieted completely. Funny thing is, sometimes it isn't the world abandoning you. Sometimes grief just convinces you nobody remembers your name anymore. Daisy rested beside the stage, staring up at him. Walter smiled faintly toward her. Then one stubborn old dog drags everybody back together again. Soft laughter moved through the crowd. Walter continued speaking about service, about loss, about Helen, about the way wounded people often saved each other without meaning to. No polished speechwriter could have created words more powerful than simple honesty spoken by a tired old man beneath winter lights. When he finally stepped away from the microphone, many people in the audience openly wiped tears from their faces. Later that evening, the music softened while snow continued falling lightly over Ash Hollow. Jack, Walter, and Daisy sat together near the edge of the square beneath glowing lanterns, while children played nearby in the snow. Emily stood beside Jack, wrapped in a thick wool scarf, her shoulder brushing lightly against his arm without either of them moving away. Daisy stretched herself comfortably between Jack and Walter, one paw resting against each man, as if refusing to leave either behind. Her amber eyes reflected the golden festival lights, while laughter and music drifted softly through the winter air. Around them, Ash Hollow glowed warm against the cold mountains, and for the first time in many years, none of the three souls sitting there felt homeless anymore. Spring arrived slowly in Ash Hollow, as if winter itself struggled to let go of the valley it had ruled for so long. Snow still clung stubbornly to the shadows beneath the pine trees, but sunlight now lingered later across Cedar Creek Lake, turning the thawing water silver beneath the evening sky. The mountains no longer looked cruel. Rivers of melted snow slipped down their sides in glittering streams, and for the first time in months, birds returned to the rooftops of Main Street. Ash Hollow breathed differently now, softer somehow, warmer. The old garage beside Jack Walker's cabin had once been little more than a forgotten storage shed, filled with rusted fishing equipment, cracked toolboxes, and military crates nobody had touched in years. By April, however, the building had transformed completely. Fresh paint covered the wooden walls. New windows reflected the lake outside. Dog beds lined one corner beside shelves filled with medical supplies, blankets, training harnesses, and donated toys. Above the entrance hung a handmade sign burned carefully into cedarwood. Cedar Creek Rescue and Companion Center. The first verdure. Jack stood outside the building early one morning, repairing a section of split fencing while Daisy rested nearby beneath fresh green grass, just beginning to push through the thawing earth. The old German shepherd looked different now. Age still showed in the grey around her muzzle and the stiffness in her injured leg. But her eyes no longer carried constant fear. She watched the world calmly again, peacefully. Every so often she lifted her head toward the sound of children laughing near the lake, or Walter Hayes humming softly inside the garage while organizing training ropes. Jack hammered another nail into the fence and paused to glance toward the water. For years his life had been measured in survival. Wake up, work, sleep, repeat. But now, mornings smelled like sawdust, coffee, wet earth, and sometimes Emily Carter's cinnamon bread, cooling on the kitchen counter. Somehow loneliness had loosened its grip without him noticing exactly when. Inside the rescue center, Walter Hayes carefully demonstrated leash handling techniques to two younger volunteers from Billings. Despite the warmth returning to the valley, the old veteran still tired more easily now. His heart condition had worsened during winter, leaving his movements slower and his breathing thinner after long hours. Yet whenever he worked with rescue dogs, life returned to his eyes immediately. Walter moved around the training floor with patient authority, silver beard catching sunlight from the open windows, while Daisy calmly obeyed his quiet commands beside him. Rescue dogs ain't machines, Walter explained gently to the volunteers. People train obedience. But trust? He scratched Daisy behind the ear softly. But trust gets earned slow. One volunteer, a tall young woman named Rachel Kim, listened closely while adjusting the harness straps. Rachel was 28, Korean-American, athletic and sharp-eyed, with black hair tied tightly beneath a baseball cap and freckles scattered lightly across her nose. Years earlier, she had worked as a paramedic in Seattle before burnout, and a difficult divorce pushed her towards search and rescue volunteer work in Montana. She spoke little but watched everything carefully, carrying the quiet patience of someone rebuilding herself one day at a time. The second volunteer, Ben Holloway, was 33, broad-chested with sandy hair and rough carpenter's hands, permanently scarred from years in construction. After serving in the National Guard overseas, Ben struggled with panic attacks, severe enough to cost him his marriage. Walter noticed immediately how Ben flinched at sudden loud noises. "Dog'll sense your fear before you do," Walter told him kindly. "But she won't judge you for it." Ben looked down quietly at that. The rescue center had begun attracting veterans from neighboring towns already, lonely men and women carrying invisible wounds who connected more easily with injured animals than with people. Emily Carter managed most of the paperwork from a small desk near the front window, while also organizing children's reading afternoons beside the lake every weekend. The library in town still mattered deeply to her, but the rescue center had become something else entirely now. A home for forgotten things. Emily looked beautiful in spring sunlight, Jack thought privately one afternoon, while watching her read aloud to children gathered beneath the pine trees outside. Her chestnut hair glowed warmly beneath the breeze, and laughter came easier to her now than it had all winter. Grief still lived inside her, of course. Some losses never fully left. But sorrow no longer stood alone inside her house at night. Nearby, Noah Bennett sat cross-legged beside Daisy, while quietly reading aloud from a children's book about rescue dogs. Months earlier, the little boy barely spoke in public. Now his voice, though still soft, drifted steadily through the spring air, while Daisy rested her head against his leg. Claire Bennett often helped Emily during reading afternoons now, smiling more easily than before. Ash Hollow itself seemed to heal in small, invisible ways around the rescue center. Earl Murphy donated food supplies every month. Reverend Samuel Reed organized transportation for elderly veterans who needed companionship visits. Even Tyler Brooks volunteered weekends building new kennel fencing, though he still looked embarrassed whenever Walter teased him about finally doing honest labor. Yet perhaps the strangest change came quietly, one rainy afternoon, when Jack received a sealed envelope from a lawyer in Billings. Inside were final property transfer papers showing Richard Coleman had officially sold Vail Mountain Resort to a local community development trust, formed jointly by Ash Hollow business owners and county leaders. Attached to the documents sat a cashier's check, made anonymously to Cedar Creek Rescue and Companion Center for nearly $50,000. No letter accompanied it. Only a typed message at the bottom of the page, for the dogs and the people who still deserve them. Jack stared at the paper for a long time. Richard had already left town weeks earlier without farewell. Some claimed he moved back east. Others said he planned to start over somewhere. Nobody knew his mistakes. Jack suspected shame, followed people farther than geography ever could. He handed the check silently to Walter later that evening. The old veteran read the amount twice before shaking his head slowly. "Man spent his whole life buying loyalty," Walter murmured. "Maybe this is the first honest thing he's ever paid for." That same evening, Jack climbed into the attic once more, carrying Mick Harper's final photograph beneath one arm. Instead of hiding it away again, He hung the picture above the fireplace beside newer photographs from the rescue center. Daisy, lying beside Noah. Walter, teaching volunteers near the lake. Emily laughing while covered in paint during renovations. The past no longer felt like something poisoning the house. It had simply become part of the story living there now. Late one afternoon in early May, the entire property around Cedar Creek glowed beneath warm, golden sunlight. Walter sat near the shoreline, fishing quietly from an old folding chair, while Daisy slept nearby in the grass. His weathered face looked thinner than winter before, but peaceful in ways Jack had never seen. Not lonely anymore. Jack repaired fencing beside the cabin, while country music drifted faintly from the garage radio. Emily sat beneath a large pine tree, reading aloud to children gathered on blankets nearby. Their laughter floated gently across the water. Daisy eventually lifted her head and looked around slowly at all of them. The old soldier hammering boards beneath sunlight, the tired widow reading stories to children. The lonely veteran fishing beside the lake with steady hands at last. Then the old German shepherd lowered herself back into the soft spring grass between them all. Around her rose the smells of pine wood, lake water, burnt coffee drifting from the open garage, and fresh earth waking after winter. Months earlier, Ash Hollow had been a town filled with lonely people hiding inside separate storms. Now laughter echoed beside Cedar Creek where silence once lived alone. Daisy had not merely rescued a man from snow. She had led an entire town back toward the kindness they feared the world had already frozen out of them forever. Sometimes, God does not send miracles in the way we expect. Sometimes he sends them with muddy paws, tired eyes, and a wounded heart that still chooses love after cruelty. Daisy did not only save a man buried beneath snow. She saved lonely souls who had forgotten how to trust, how to forgive, and how to belong to one another again. Jack learned that grief does not disappear when we hide from the world. Walter discovered that, even after terrible loss, life can still offer one more sunrise worth waking up for. And an entire town remembered that kindness is stronger than fear when people choose compassion over pride. In our daily lives, many people walk through silent winters no one else can see. Some carry sorrow, loneliness, regret, or memories too heavy to speak aloud. But perhaps God places certain souls in our path so we can help carry each other home before it is too late. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope tonight. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel so more people can discover stories about love, healing, faith, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your family, warm every lonely heart in your home, and remind you that even after the coldest winter, mercy and light can still return again.